Welcome to my transparent watercolor tutorial, Simple Waterfall. This is a narrated step-by-step tutorial of a simple waterfall painting. In this video, I'll review my palette, talk about the color mixes, and then go through the development of this painting. This is the companion video to my Simple Waterfall demonstration video, which is set to music at 3x speed so you can watch the uninterrupted evolution of the painting. I referenced the photograph on the right for inspiration, however, it wasn't my intent to copy that photograph. I used the photograph to help develop my sketch, and then I put it away and didn't use any reference after that point. Before I begin painting, I've decided that I'm going to mask some of the areas to preserve some of the whitest whites for splashing water and flowing water. So to do this, I'm going to use a fine liner masking pen and apply it generously in various areas around where the water is. I continue with a masking pen, given the suggestion of the flow of the water and the current and water cascading down the waterfall. Another area I'm going to use this is up above to give a suggestion of tree trunks. I also use the pen to give just a suggestion of a few highlights going across the rocky surface. Another technique I use to apply mask is to dip a toothbrush into a jar of masking fluid and just give it a little bit of a splatter. This helps give the suggestion of splashing water, and even up in the trees it can give the suggestion of texture. When using this technique, if there's an area that you want to protect, you can put a tissue or something over to cover it while you do this. Another easy way is, after it's dry, just come back and lift off in an area where you don't want it. Before I start painting, I'll take a moment to review my palette. I use a ceramic palette that I keep pretty clean. I keep my mixing wells clean. It has 30 colors on it, and there's probably 8 to 10 that I use more frequently than others. For this painting, I used 4 colors, starting from the top right, royal blue, to the left, pyro red, and sap green, and viridian. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the mixing of these colors. A mixture that I like to use a lot, I use in a number of my paintings, is a combination of sap green and pyro red. The touch of pyro red into the sap green takes the rawness off the color, and the more you put in, it takes it more towards neutral. By taking the mixture of sap green and pyro red and adding royal blue to it, I can get a cooler green, or I can use that also to get a much darker green. I use varying amounts of the sap green, pyro red, and royal blue together, and when I don't thin it out a lot, I can get a very dark green. The next color combination is a mixture of royal blue and viridian, and I use these primarily for the water in this painting. I'm going to start this painting working in the background, given the suggestion of distant trees. I'm using a mixture of sap green, pyro red with a little bit of royal blue in it to give it a cooler feel and make it seem more distant so that it's set in the background. As I paint this, I try not to make all the trees the same height, and I try to make the spacing between some of the peaks vary so that they're not equal distances between the trees. You want to try and keep variety in spacing and shape and height as you develop your painting. I like to use this spray bottle. It does a nice job of softening the edges on the paint, and it helps diffuse some of the color. And some of these paintings, this type of a painting, it helps give a bit of a misty feel to the distant background. So now I'm starting to do a little bit of work in the foreground. I'm still using the same cool color, and it's giving a suggestion of some shadow, but I'm going to start to develop the rocky surfaces and some of the hard surface in the foreground. And as I started, I decided I was using too small a brush, so I switched to one of my favorites, which is a silver black velvet jumbo round small brush. It's a brush I really like, and you should always try and use the largest brush you feel comfortable with the task that you're doing. You want to try and avoid using a very little brush where you have to just try and noodle away just to get the surface covered. You could easily do a painting like this using a 1 or a 2-inch brush and using the tips and corners if you decided to. As I paint this, you can tell I'm not trying to do a rendering. This is a fairly simple painting, and I'm putting just enough of a brush stroke down to give the suggestion of rocks or smooth surfaces or something going behind something. Now I start to work in the foreground, starting to give a suggestion of some pine trees up on the ridge. And I'm doing these with a mixture of sap green and pyrrole red. I don't have any royal blue in this at this point, and it's a bit warmer than what I used in the background. When you're painting things like these pine trees or objects like this that are similar, you want to try and vary them so they don't all look the same. You can do that by changing the height or the width and adjust the spacing so each tree isn't the same distance from one to the other. In a situation like this, it isn't really where you want repetition like that. And you can tell I'm not trying to render these trees. I'm just making pine tree-like shapes that give the suggestion that there's trees sitting up there. And I like to use this Atelier spray to soften the edges and diffuse some color. It just helps it blend in and gives it a nice feel. And now I'm coming in a little bit wet on wet, and you can see the water runs a little bit from where the paper is wet from the spray. That's one of the things I like about doing a painting like this. When you're not trying to create a historical record of something and reproduce a photograph, you have the freedom just to lay down washes and experiment. You're not so worried about going over an edge or outside an edge or a shape or something that doesn't look like what's in your photograph. So now I'm going to start to paint some of the water, and I'm going to apply a wash that's a combination of royal blue and viridian. I think it's a very pleasing color that those two make, and I'm just being generous with the brush, just a very loose wash, and coming in with a spray bottle to soften edges and diffuse some of the color. It gives it a nice watery effect. And keep in mind that I've used masking fluid here, so I'm going to reach a point where I'll dry the paper and remove that, and then I'll still get some of the whitest whites of the paper showing through. And again, you want to use a fairly large brush here. You don't want to use a little brush, and you can see how they would take you quite some time to accomplish what I just did in a few seconds, and it wouldn't have the natural feel to it as it does just applying a nice loose wash with a big brush. Here you can see I've started to use a much darker value. It's still the same color combination of royal blue and viridian, but there's less water in the mixture. And I'm still not overly concerned about some of the color bleeding in over edges. It gives that spray feeling of a waterfall coming down. So I've dried the paper. That's one of the things that you don't see in the video, is I added out the use of the hairdryer, which I use quite frequently. I put down a layer, then I dry it, then I put a layer on top of it and I dry it. And it gets much lighter when you dry it. That's just how watercolor reacts when it dries. It always dries lighter than when it's wet. So now I'm coming in with a little sharper point on my brush, and I'm being a little bit more specific where I'm laying in this darker value. Here I'm beginning to lay in some more pine tree shapes, and these are a darker value yet. So you can see I start to have kind of 3 layers of trees here, the very distant foggy tree shapes that I put in initially, and then the second round of them, and now I'm putting in a third area of pine trees, and using a much darker value, and it's a warmer green than I've used in the other areas. I'll weave some of these darker values across the ground and behind rocks. It starts to give definition that there's a level up there, there's a flat surface. One of the things I'm doing in this painting is I started with a very back layer of trees, and I used quite a bit of spray to soften it, and it was a cooler green. And then I started to use a little warmer green as I came forward and got a little darker value, and I still softened the edges quite a bit. But now that I come to the foreground and up on the ridge of this, the pine trees are a little warmer and darker valued. And even though I've softened the edges a little bit with the spray, I haven't done it near as much as I did in the 2 layers behind that. I'm using the spray bottle to try and bring some of that green tone off the trees. Down on the rocky surface, it just helps tie the composition together. And in order to work that same green tone throughout the composition, I'm starting to apply a very dark valued green in the water, because you're going to pick up some of that reflection of that green tone in a water. It's going to occur naturally. So it helps represent what would happen, and it also helps tie the composition together as I get that green tone, so it's just not so isolated on the pine trees. Coming in again with a spray bottle, trying to diffuse some of that color across the surface. I'm starting to do a little bit of work on the rocky ledge there and just give the suggestion that there are boulders and large rocky shapes. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail and render these. They're just a suggestion of what's there. Trying to use a combination of hard and soft edges here and lost and found edges. Some of it I'm leaving up to the eye to complete. You can see I still like to use that very fine mist spray to diffuse color. I really like the effect that I get with it. I have a few different spray bottles. Most of them have a much more coarse spray than this bottle that I found that Atelier makes. It just does such a nice job of diffusing the color, but if you have one and it feels like a mist when it hits your hand instead of like a splatter, then it's probably fine enough to do the job. So I've reached the point here where I'm ready to remove the masking that I've applied. So I've thoroughly dried the paper, and now I'm coming in with a rubber cement eraser, pickup eraser, and I'm picking up that masking fluid, and you can see where the very white of the paper is now coming through, and it gives a nice highlight. Coming in with a fine point brush to just alter the shape of that large white shape on the water a little bit. I wasn't quite happy with what I had. And the brush I'm using is called a Black Gold Quill Series. It's not a small brush, but it's got an extremely sharp point on it, and I can do some very nice detail work with it. Now I'm coming in with some very deliberate dark values using this fine point brush, and I want to try and move this value throughout the composition. Helps give it depth. And now my decisions aren't based on anything I'm looking at a photograph. It's just me trying to design with shapes and values and trying to help move the eye through the composition. And now these little touches of dark value help to send the shapes of the trees forward, or the rocky edge of the cliff forward, or helps give depth to what's going on in various areas of the painting. As I'm working with this darker tone, I've made a decision that I want to try and put still a darker value pine tree shape there, and so you can see how I've little by little have come with darker values as I move towards the foreground, and I've built a number of layers of these pine trees just by putting in these various levels of value. I'm going to continue to use this tone to help reinforce where rocky edges are and where the background is, and help weave some of these tones throughout the whole scene. And I'm going to try and put a little pine tree shape there to bring the eye down a little bit more, and show that there's a tree occurring a little lower on the ledge. Still using a little bit darker value to give a little more definition to the rocky ledge. And now I'm taking a flat brush with some water on it. It's actually an angled flat brush, but just a good stiff flat brush will work with some water. And I'm doing some lifting, and I'm going across the darker shapes and dragging some of that color into the lighter areas. So it does two things. It removes some of the pigment from the darker shapes, and it carries some of it straight into the lighter area, suggesting the continuation of a line. That's one of the things I do a lot on some of my floral paintings, and it has a nice effect. Sometimes I'll come back in afterwards and put a little darker tone on the edges of those areas I've lifted off to give a little bit more contrast. Now I'm coming in with a rigger brush, and I'm just giving the suggestion of a couple old straggly trees back here. I think they call them nags, and that you see in some of these pine forests. It just helps create some interest, and gives a little bit of variability, so it's a little different than just your regular pine tree shape. And here again, you want to try and vary the height of these and the shapes of them a little bit and the levels they're finished. Just try and keep that variation so that everything doesn't look the same. I'm also going to take this rigger and just make some like fallen type logs. You can see, so just I lift as I come up to a tree shape and go behind it and come out on the other side. And I'm doing the same thing here. You see the interruptions in that line. It just suggests that the other tree shape's going over top of it, and it helps build depth in the scene, because you have the impression of something behind something else, and the more you do that, the more layers you build, it gives the perception that there's more depth there. And I'm dragging some of these shapes more in the foreground too, because that's what you see when you look into a forest or a wooded area. You'll normally see some things falling on the ground, and again, these aren't rendered trees or logs or anything. They're just value statements that give the suggestion that there could be a log or a tree or something there. Just put in a few finishing touches on, using a dark tone to change an edge that I didn't like. And that's it. Thanks for watching.